Good evening, Elaine.
Good evening.
After a really fascinating talk yesterday, I have a few questions about it.
Okay.
You're doing some research, and part of your research is about religious identities. Could you just give me a definition of what this is?
Yes. So just to give you a little bit of background to lead into that question, the answer to that question, our research right now is an 8-country study of scientists' understandings of religion. Is one facet of it, and we're also interested in understanding gender and responses to science in the societies that we're studying. So religious identity, is something that differs according to country. So we define as sociologists what the dominant religious traditions are in the country, and then ask the people, the scientists that we surveyed, whether or not they belong to those religious traditions. But then in a second sense, religious identity is very much just scientists' own understandings of religion. So there's a piece of our study which wants to discover if scientists understand religion and religious categories differently than the general public. So we want to have new understandings of religious identity as well.
And you mentioned that there are 8 countries, which I believe are the US, the UK, France, Italy, Turkey, India, Taiwan and Hong Kong. How did you select these countries?
So the countries were selected on several different indices. So we wanted in particular to select countries that had different levels of religion and different types of religion. So the religious context of a country like Turkey, for example, which is in one sense influenced by Islam and in another sense is influenced by secularity, is very different than the state church of England or the kind of intensive religiosity of the United States. So varying according to religious context of the country and how that might have an impact on scientists' own understandings of religion in those particular nations. Secondly, we wanted to study nations that had different levels and types of scientific infrastructure, which we thought could have an impact on religion and science connections or lack thereof. We also wanted to understand countries that are in different geographic locales and have different levels of economic development. And then this is sort of the dirty side of sociology, but there are always practical factors. So there are certain nations that would have been amazing to study, but where I have no personal connections to other scholars who could help me get access to the scientists in those nations, or where it would just be too difficult to send graduate students, where it would be hard to find other scholars who have PhDs in those countries to help me, or where the scientific infrastructure is either non-existent. There aren't very many universities that confer science degrees. So that's, as we always say, that's for other researchers to do.
You mentioned scientists as carriers of secularization. What do you mean by this?
So one of the early sociology founders in the social sciences, to be honest, both sociologists and economists and political scientists claim him, is the German social thinker Max Weber. And Weber coined the term carrier, and I've kind of revived it in my work. I really like the term. So carrier refers to a people group who comes to be seen as synonymous with a certain set of symbols or ideas. So you might think about the example of nursing and gender. So nursing, in some ways, is so synonymous with the category of being a woman, because there's so many more women in nursing than men, although that has changed over the past 20 or so years, that we have to signify when a nurse is not a woman. You might recognize if you go into a hospital, someone might say, oh, you'll be having a male nurse, to signify that this is, someone who's not quite part of the category that we make synonymous with nursing. Well, in the kind of research that I'm doing on scientists' own understandings of religion, I'm interested to find out if scientists are so synonymous with secularization, with being irreligious. Is this a category that we think of as symbolic of or synonymous with what it means to be a scientist? And under what conditions are scientists secular people? Are those categories so tight that it's hard to imagine that they would be divorced? Or under what conditions is it completely legitimate for scientists to be religious? So that's one of the things that our project is very interested in finding out.
And yesterday you presented on the UK.
Yes.
Why is the UK so interesting in relationship to science and religion?
Well, in part because I like to spend time in Cambridge, but the UK is interesting because there's so much religion every place in one sense. So, the most prestigious academic institutions, this is no surprise to the listeners, have Bible verses over doors of scientific laboratories.
Yeah.
There are statues of religious figures. There is a state church at the civil and institutional level, at the macro level of the country. Yet, the UK is seen as being a very secular place at the same time. And that kind of juxtaposition of religious tradition and symbols being everywhere, yet a kind of, in the eyes of some scholars, a kind of secularity, a lack of participation in religion, a kind of belonging to religious institutions but not participating very much, is very interesting context to study the science and religion tensions or overlap.
Talking about overlapping, you mentioned overlapping magisterium?
Magisterium, yes,
Thank you.
yes.
What is this?
Well, this is a phrase that I did not coin, but the paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould got quite a bit of traction with this idea, and he thought of non-overlapping magisterium as an antidote to the entire religion and science discussion. He thought, well, let's make it so that science is in one kind of domain of the natural world, and religion is in another kind of domain of the non-material world, of the aesthetic world. And he thought that would solve everything. That if we just kind of kept these things completely separate, that would be just fine. But, I don't think, at least what we're finding in our research so far, that that's how real people live their real lives. So I just talked to a scientist today, for example, as part of the study, who considers themselves to be a very secular person, to not participate in religion at all, but yet has a Muslim graduate student who wants to practice prayer, which is in keeping with her religious tradition. And this secular scientist who would like to have religion and science be completely non-overlapping must figure out a place for this graduate student to engage in her religious rituals, and wants to be encouraging of this student, wants to be a faithful mentor, using that word faithful intentionally in this context, and wants to know how this can happen. So when we get down to how real people live their lives, it's hard to maintain completely non-overlapping domains in the way that someone like Stephen Jay Gould would have thought of as ideal.
Okay. And one other thing you mentioned, which I found very interesting, is that you mentioned that in the UK, religion is quite a private matter. Did this have an effect on the responses you got from your participants?
I think it did very much. So in the example I just gave, it almost was particularly troubling to that scientist because the scientist did not want to have to deal with religion in the laboratory in this way, because religion is such a privatized matter. The scientist kind of wished that he didn't know that this student is religious, and even said during the course of our interview that this is surprising to me. We don't really know how to engage with this kind of overt religiosity because in the UK, religion is such a private matter. And time again, among the scientists that I have interviewed, there is that phrase when we interview UK scientists, we like this, that religion is such a private matter in UK science. And that then makes it particularly jarring when it's no longer private. And that has an impact on how they think about the religion and science interface or lack of.
And did you notice if age, gender, did any of this play a part?
We've not completely analyzed these data, so you'll have to interview me again for part 2. We're in the initial phase, but I want to give a little teaser to your listeners. There does appear to be somewhat of what we would call a cohort effect, a generational effect, which means that it looks like in our data so far that younger scientists are a little bit more religious than older scientists, rather than a life course effect, which would be that a person naturally gets more religious or less religious over time as they say age. In fact, we would expect in the general public that persons tend to become a little bit more religious as they age, or consider religion a little bit more seriously for different kinds of reasons. But we're finding in this study so far that it's actually surprisingly the younger scientists who are a little bit more religious, and we're interested to explore these data more to figure out whether that is really the case over time.
You talk about legitimate and illegitimate religion.
These are not my categories, but these are the categories that the scientists that we have interviewed in the UK utilized quite often. So they love to talk about in some ways they're positive about religion because they have a kind of affection for the Church of England in particular, which they see their Anglicanism as having a kind of flexibility, a kind of possibility to be interpreted in many different ways. Really, the personal, each individual person can give a personality almost to their own religious expression. On the other hand, they're concerned, UK scientists I mean, they're concerned about the recent insurgence of immigrants, particularly from India and the Middle East, where Hinduism and Islam are more likely to be prominent. They're concerned that these new religious forms, not new of course in terms of their history in the world, but newer to the UK, may have an impact on how these minority religious traditions view science, may have an impact on the religion and science interface. They are seeing Hindu and Muslim graduate students in their labs, and they're wondering how to deal with what they perceive as, and which they called, I think, somewhat pejoratively in some cases, a kind of illegitimate religion that doesn't seem to have as much flexibility. This is not my words, but theirs. A religion that may, in some corners, be in conflict with science, and it's striking to them and difficult, and they do not think that they have the tools necessarily to adequately deal with it.
Something that came up in the Q&A was self-selection effect.
We always worry about this when we do surveys. So surveys, for those of you who don't know, are you may have taken one with a telemarketer, say. So I ask you a question and I give you a number of boxes to check, and I decide as the researcher ahead of time what kind of boxes you can check. Well, that's in basic terms what a survey is. Self-selection effect are the people who take the survey, right? Okay. So if I do a survey of highly educated people and I utilize a web survey, I utilize computers for those people, that's just fine because most highly educated people have access to computer. But if I want to get people involved in my survey who have very low education, it's probably best not to use a web survey because people with lower education are somewhat less likely to have access to computer resources. And so if I do that web survey and I find, oh my gosh, people are more educated than I thought, my results may not be right because there is a self-selection effect. So it's natural in that case because the method I used for people who are highly educated to take part of the survey and for people who are lower educated to self-select, decide themselves to opt out. So in the lecture yesterday, people were asking about the people who didn't participate in the survey of UK scientists. Was there something different about these people? Were they different in a way that might have an impact on the results of the study? And that's something that we worry a great deal about as survey researchers. What we do to mitigate that possibility is we gather a great deal of information on the entire population of people who could have participated in the study, what we call the sampling frame, the whole frame of people who could have participated. And we try to find out if the people who didn't participate are different in some way that would have an impact on the study than the people who did participate. And so far, we're not finding that to be the case.
Okay. Now, I'm excited because I spent a lot of time in France, and I hear the next country you are planning to study and investigate is France, but from my own experience, it's quite a challenging place to go, perhaps, because it's very secular.
Yes.
What are your feelings about going there?
I feel great about going there. Love croissants. Love the beauty. Yeah, so in one sense, it's not a challenging place to go at all.
No.
In another sense, all joking aside, it is a challenging place to study religion because religion seems to be so insignificant to many French, and so it's very different than, say, doing a study of scientists' views on religion in the U.S., where even for the most secular of scientists, they still think religion's really interesting because there are lots and lots of people around them who are super religious, so they have to talk about it. In France, fewer people talk about it in general, so what we worry about is that we just won't be able to engage them in the conversation. So I think what we're going to do there is probably lead with other aspects of our broader research agenda. So we're also interested in ethics in science. We're interested in reception of science in the broader public, and so we probably will frame the study or start with those topics and then ease French scientists into talking about religion since they're a little bit less comfortable doing so. So it's a wonderful, it's an amazing country to study science. It's a country where there's a lot of increases in scientific technology. The CERN experiment, the largest particle physics experiment in the world, is located in part of France, and so it's the right place for this study. It will be a challenge, but sometimes really challenging things are worth doing.
And you'll be back in the UK on the 24th of September to present your full research. Where will that be?
So we are having a conference on the 24th of September in London to present results of the study from the UK, further analyses from the UK that are more robust, but also from India and Italy. So we're doing 8 countries, so we'll be presenting results from 3 of them on the 24th of September.
Well, thank you, Elaine. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much.